spot for themselves.
All right, so then today, Pete Thamel, ESPN, on the ACC. So what's going to happen with them? Of course, we know about Florida State raising their leg on a fire hydrant last week. We know that there are still teams right now a part of the Pac-12. What might happen? Who knows? But Pete Thamel, sources, in the next 24 hours, there are calls for the ACC to vet and have early exploratory discussions on the potential addition of Cal and Stanford. One is for ACC athletic directors, and the other, the league's presidents and chancellors.
I mean, good for Cal and Stanford if they can wind up back in a P5 league. But again, you're going to have two schools that are at a tremendously huge disadvantage in that every single one of their road games is going to be on the East Coast, as opposed to everyone else who will just have a few over there. So while they may have to do this, it stopped making sense. I mean, a long time ago, but this would, I mean, again, if they can stay in it and they have opportunities for athletes, that's great, but it's not going to be easy to wrap your head around.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack here. I mean, I think one of the more interesting stories from last week, outside of obviously the three corners joining Colorado while I was gone, was the private equity discussion with Florida State. Don't know really how to feel about that just yet, but they've continued to make their stance clear. I know some feel like the bridge is about to blow up, the ACC ship, but I don't know. It still feels like there's at least a little more. This is not going to happen quickly, just because there's a lot of things that have to be answered. It's not just as simple as like pay your buyout and everything. I don't know. There's just a lot to unpack there. But I know the idea here is stemming that off, right? You add those schools, and in theory, the idea is that it would reopen your TV deal and that you could get more money, and then that could potentially satisfy your barkers like Florida State, for example, and make them happy and whole. I'm just failing to see how they would bring that much money to make that happen.
Nobody was excited about them in the first place.
Right, like they're just out there right now, and they're maybe joining the ACC, or maybe they relent and finally join the Big 12, or maybe they stay together and they form the Pac-WAC AAC combination, or maybe they go independent, or maybe they do that. I just don't see – I would need to see numbers and charts, of all things, to explain how those two would bring enough extra money to the table to satisfy Florida State alone, much less the rest that are, potentially looking for a way out of the ACC earlier than, the lengthy decade plus remaining on their contract. That just doesn't make sense to me. But I think, if you're those two and you're Oregon State, you're Washington State, you're looking at every possible scenario. Yeah. So that story makes sense from that regard, but it doesn't make much sense from other, glances.
Here's one of the things. If it doesn't add more money to each team in the ACC, why do it?
Yeah, it doesn't make any sense.
Only way, and I said this earlier, and again, I'm just absolutely just kind of throwing out the idea here, is if you add somebody that does bring in some value, maybe then they change the length of the contract and renegotiate it where everyone gets a little bit more and it's not as long. That is about the only way I could see that happening. Brett Bingham, why go to a conference that has teams actively trying to get out like an FSU? It's another error in bad judgment, in my opinion. Carmelo, adding them, is it going to prevent the 7 and 8 teams in the ACC that want to leave already?
Well, it's not going to. Remember, what Florida State and probably any subsequent team that would potentially leave the ACC are asking is to double their money. Like, that's why private equities come into this. That's why all these things have happened around FSU, because they're not seeking just to get out of an expiring contract because it's not expiring. They're trying to double their money as fast as they can.
Well, they're not going to do that.
Yeah.
But I don't care about it. They're not. That's a negotiation. Yeah, if you want 50, you ask for 75.
But right now that's their contention,
right,
which is why it makes even less sense to me that they think it can happen like that.
Well, and that could be that just trying to, trying to find some stability, whether Cal Stanford bring that to the table. With all due respect to those schools and athletic departments, that remains up in the air.
Well, I mean, they would bring late night games potentially in that reworked TV deal. They would bring new markets. They'd bring obviously, the Bay Area and some West Coast flavor. So there is that. But yeah, it's only 2 teams, and so that would be really complicated for those two schools. A lot of additional travel costs, and how much money do they end up bringing to the table? But the part about the shortened contract, that seems like it maybe be one way. I don't know if you're the ACC why you're really agreeing to that, though. You got to have, what's your catch? Like, what benefit do you get out of bringing them in if it's for less money and it doesn't satisfy everybody, and then you shorten your that just sounds like it's playing right into the hands of those that want to leave more so than it's playing into the hands of the ACC. So we definitely need to hear more details on why that would make sense. But again, if you're Cal, Stanford, Oregon, Washington, the leftovers in the Pac-12, you're trying to find any suitable landing pad and exploring everything. So that's something to keep an eye on, because clearly eyes are on the ACC now, still on the Pac, still very much on those four and what's going to happen with them, because it affects a lot of different things. But it does makes sense that the ACC is a part of the mix, because they are very clearly in the midst of their own turmoil at the moment.
Yeah, the Pac-12 is on the clock, but they have been. The ACC is trying to figure some things out. Even the Big 12's not done because of the possible additions. And you see, and now that a lot of what the smoke has cleared, all that, remember the questions about UConn? Maybe they jump right back in it now that the ground, or at least the carpet, has been laid. Chris, Super Chat, thank you. Craig, last week we had Super Chats of $199.99 and $150. Is it one show, Garrett? Am I right? That was in one show.
One show.
It was a phenomenal deal. We appreciate all of that. From Chris, guys, Florida State has become problematic for the ACC. Are there any protections in the grant of rights to not damage the ACC and the ESPN brands with their complaints?
Well, if there are, FSU clearly not worried about them. The statement from their board president on a podcast the day before the board of trustees meeting was, no document's going to keep us from doing what we want to do.
Well, it's easy to say.
Yeah, it's easy to, but I'm just telling to follow their logic or lack thereof. But so why would they be worried about saying mean things if that's the whole strategy? So maybe there are, but clearly they're not worried about it at this time.
Yeah, UNC AD Bubba Cunningham was on doing an interview, and he made it sound a little bit more complicated than Florida State made it sound, getting out of that whole grant of rights agreement and everything else. So there's definitely a tale of two opinions, but Florida State's being brash about it, and they don't care. They're being upfront about their intentions, and I don't think, to your question, that there's really anything that's going to stop them from doing everything possible to get out of that deal sooner rather than later. So you can have all these mechanisms in place, and maybe they do make them, or force them into a situation where they've got to stick around longer than they want. But ultimately, Florida State is going to find a way before that contract runs out to get themselves out of the ACC. It feels like that's inevitable as anything else.
But